Before I get started, I think it's a pretty short time frame that I've received. I want a quick show of hands. How many engineers in the group? How many product managers in the group? How many designers? All right, very, very good mix. So that's, precisely what I was hoping for at Future of Work. Some of you may have attended the last two sessions, the last two conferences of Future of Work as well. In the very first one, there was a panel discussion in which I made a few mentions about the evolving role of engineers. And in the second edition, which happened last year, I gave a fairly detailed talk on how I see the role of engineers evolving over time. Okay. What I didn't talk about as much is what kind of decisions that has led to at Udaan, because it was not just a talk. A lot of those were, backed by concrete decisions that we made at Udaan. So in today's discussion, I'm here to talk about all of those decisions, and hopefully, as you see how we iterate over decisions, how we make mistakes in some of those decisions, and how we correct them. Hopefully, all of these labels of tech guru and visionary, etc., would disappear the next time around. But yeah, so quick summary of the last time's talk. Accessibility plus open source plus public cloud is equal to a lot of improved productivity for people, for engineers in particular. And that means that they can plow back all of that saved time into being something more, solving bigger scale problems. And that is going to be the underlying theme in the discussion today as well, okay? Last caveat, these were decisions that worked for us. Every organization has different context. So your mileage may vary. Okay, it's up to you, which pieces you pick, which pieces you don't. Let's start with the first one. The first choice that we made, direct exposure to problems. Before Udaan, I was running the technology team for Flipkart. Absolutely fantastic place. Most of my learning actually came from that. In fact, for all three of us founders at Udaan, pretty much all of our learning can be attributed to that journey. One of the patterns that I saw played out very consistently was when you had product managers, a business guy, and an engineer, you would have a certain information flow that would be happening. Okay, either a product manager would be developing a direct taste of the problem, or some business person would have a discussion with that product manager, and then the information would translate out in some form to the engineer in a processed fashion, in a filtered fashion. This is traditionally how companies have worked, and I'll skip the history of why I believe things evolved this way, but this essentially leads to a lot of translation loss, and this prevents great products from being created. We live in a time when figuring out how to use technology in the most effective fashion is a large driver of how effective a product is. Okay? In such a scenario, engineers who are exposed to the widest variety of technologies are actually very, very well placed to make these decisions themselves. Okay? So instead of this translation loss that would happen, if you expose an engineer directly to the end problem, that engineer would end up making better, more productive decisions, not just about the product, but also about the kinds of trade-offs that need to be made. Which piece needs to be hacked away, and which piece needs to be a lot more stable. Engineers in the audience, I'm hoping you are able to relate to what I'm actually saying. I used to witness a lot of conversations of the kind that a product manager would say, "Oh, but this should just take a day. Why should it take more than a day? 6 months earlier, it took you, a day to do this." And this engineer would be like, "No, but you hadn't told me that this is also a possibility I need to account for." Okay, so all of these kinds of conversations used to happen. Okay, the point is, if the person who's designing the internals of that product if they do not know all the possible ways in which things can evolve, they would end up doing a poor job. And that then shows up in your product. Okay? So which is the reason why I made a very, very drastic call when we started Udaan. Okay? And product managers are going to hate me for this, but I decided not to have product managers. Okay? And so every engineer would be directly exposed to a problem, and they would go about studying the problem on the field. They would talk to the users directly. They would witness the pain of the user. They would get the gali of the user, and they would get the satisfaction, the direct satisfaction of that transformation that a person actually goes through. I'll give you an example. There is this in our warehousing setup at Udaan, there is this engineer who actually, was building something. And this engineer actually went on the warehouse floor. And the people who were actually doing those picks, that picking process in a warehouse, they had a lot of inputs to give. And, this guy was processing all of that. And some of those came together in a very nice way. Some of those ideas came together in such a nice way. Like sitting right then and there, in a matter of a few hours, this guy actually had rolled out a change that started saving 30 minutes per day of those people. And the kind of transformation that he witnessed in the face of those pickers is what actually gave meaning to his work. And that's what I love about the idea of exposing people directly to the problem. All of us derive meaning, from what we do. The best form of deriving that meaning is when you witness the outcome of your work directly. In the absence of that, you fall back to your manager giving you an acknowledgement. Yes, bhaiya, tumne bahut acha kaam kiya hai. Okay? But that's a very poor substitute for the kind of meaning, the kind of gratification you can derive when you directly witness the work, that you put out. As part of all of this, we made certain institutional changes. We said that every engineer would be out in the field, talking to the user directly at a well-defined frequency. So we institutionalized that process. It's, in the early days, it was once every 6 weeks. As we grew, it became once every 3 months. But they have to be mandatorily on the field every, n number of weeks and be talking to the user, come back, report the finding. And every single time they would talk, all the various things that would just be a bug report suddenly became real. Like, a person telling you, कि sir, मैं कैसे use करूँ इसको? Okay, आप करके दिखाइए. And when that embarrassment that you actually go through, that creates a very different level of motivation. As part of this, obviously, because when we start expecting engineers to become product managers as well, your hiring process needs to go through a change. And what we did was we redefined the hiring process. We said that we'll have a base programming round to validate that we wouldn't have to train you on programming, which is the base tool that you use. Second round was a product round, which was about, given a real life problem, what kind of a product would you build? How would you go about researching the problem? How do you identify success or failure? Can you quantify success and failure? How would you go about iterating? How would you test out a hypothesis? All of these sort of things. And third being, what kind of past work you've done, what kind of decisions you made, how comfortable you are with ambiguity, and how much learning you go, how do you go about learning more things. So 3 rounds, very different from how a typically an engineer is interviewed, and we got that feedback every single time. I was never expecting this. But this hiring, restructuring was a natural outcome of us having that expectation from those people. Okay. So with that came, so now that we have engineers who are doubling up as product managers, came the need to, how do we make sure that it actually happens? Setting an expectation is one thing, but on a day-to-day basis, if the engineer is just going on talking about, my dev closure has happened for this product. Some of you, nodding your heads about dev closure, right? I have done my part, right? Or a conversation about, meri build hi fasi hui hai. Okay? What we did was, we worked towards, we made a bunch of decisions explicitly towards making sure that the end outcome orientation that typically a product manager has, that orientation actually seeps into the engineer. So what we started doing was, we said that, firstly, there is no code ownership, there's no system ownership. Okay? So at Flipkart, what we used to have was, and I'm giving Flipkart examples only as a way of talking through my learning. You know, it's a fantastic place, and some of the best engineers that I've worked with are there. At Flipkart, what I'd created was that, you know, we had the notion of a code ownership, that this system is authored by me, so I'm the owner. So no matter who in the organization actually is making a change, if it is this system, it needs to go through me. And suddenly what happens is, every single project that you can imagine has every single system being impacted. You're getting why that happens, right? Because, you know, most products actually span a bunch of, most meaningful products actually span a bunch of different systems. So if you have system level ownership, every single change for a user needs to have some n number of systems covered. So then you need to get these n number of people gathered together in the room. Then you would think, okay, why am I doing this? Let me go ahead and hire a program manager to do this. So then you have program managers who are actually going about doing this assembly of people for you. Any program managers in the group? Okay, don't feel bad, please. I know that, you know, this is been my experience. So yeah, you essentially bring in more people in order to address that additional complexity. Okay. Instead, what we did at Udaan was, we called out problem statement ownership. So if you are the person whose job is to figure out how to reduce the amount of time it takes to place an order, or how to reduce the cost of logistics, or how to increase the number of orders being placed by somebody, no matter what system you actually need to touch, go ahead and make a change. Go ahead and make a change. Okay? What that did was, the boundaries of decision making suddenly came down to one person. And which is why we essentially had one person teams. Okay? Which brings me to the, we'll talk about that in the next point as well, lean teams, but a bit more on this. So we changed, we walked away from code ownership to problem statement ownership. Then what we did was, our Monday weekly meetings where, you know, as a product team, everybody got together, we made sure that the only thing we are talking about is outcome. So people wouldn't talk about, okay, I am on this stage of development and the next stage of development is this. Instead of any of these kinds of conversations, we got into, last to last week, I had rolled out this feature. This was the change that I was expecting. In reality, this is the change that I've observed. So these are some additional experiments that I'm planning, and I'll be reporting back to this group a week later. So it all outcome oriented, absolutely no input oriented discussion. Obviously, on the floor, you would have a lot of technical discussions, but in formal forums, the only thing that matters is the outcome. All right. Same for our roadmap reviews. Every single roadmap that we had was not about what system you are building. It is about what goal you are trying to achieve. That would always be the starting point, and you would get into how I'm planning to do that. And a lot of times you may not even have the complete list of how, but you're still committing to a goal in order to make sure that you always are pushing the boundaries of what you're comfortable with. As part of this, an interesting side effect was that, like, as part of how do we make sure that people are solitarily focused on the end goal, I did away with performance reviews. Okay? Why? This was another bit of learning that I had, that when you have people trying to, go about doing their day job of building products, etc., as the performance review time frame came, every single activity would be about hitting a mark on a particular competency. So at Flipkart, we had a bunch of competencies defined. And every single activity would be, okay, let me go ahead and build a new service. Why? Because it would give me additional points on architecture. Okay, let me go ahead and do a customer survey because it would actually give me some points on product piece. All right, it's human behavior. It's not the fault of the people involved. Some of the best people, like some of whom are here at Udaan, actually fell prey to that. That's the issue of incentives. So what I said was the performance review at Udaan is binary, and I'm currently talking about the product group. Performance review is binary. Either you are in or you're out. If you are, so feedback is continuous, performance review is binary, and your salary changes and any of the additional things that you think about. We don't have titles. Everybody's an engineer. I'm an engineer at Udaan. So you go ahead and the only thing that actually matters for you is salary. That, that actually grows in a very well-defined fashion. So if you are to join Udaan, you know your immediate salary, you know your next year's salary, you know your next to next year's salary, and henceforth. Okay? Bit contentious, actually quite contentious. Yeah, I don't think that even internally everybody is comfortable with this, but this is a call that I made. Okay? And yes, it did achieve the required outcome. People do not end up caring about promotions. People genuinely care about their growth. Am I attacking more and more complex problems? Am I making people's lives better? Am I learning more things? That's what people end up bothering about. The third piece is staying lean. Now, with this kind of a structure, what it allowed us to do was, it allowed us not to have very large teams. Instead, one or two people working on a particular problem, because their ownership is towards that problem, that outcome, not the systems that they are building. Okay, and pretty much most of you, I presume, would have actually gone through certain large companies, and where you would see the sheer bureaucracy at work, where to get a decision made means 5 meetings, with groups of 12 people, and iterating over n number of instances in order to make a decision. So fat begets fat. Okay, this is something I believe most of you would agree. Like, let's stay lean, right? Well, guess what? When you actually start doing it, it's hard, extremely hard. Amongst all of the choices that I'm describing out, this was the hardest to actually adhere to. Because it's super duper easy to just say that, okay, let's add more people. This was the hardest piece. For the longest time, we had one person per problem. So if it means that that person is sick or something, then for that time, that thing actually, that area wouldn't move. If that's the degree of leanness with which we were running, and for which I still get crap from my friends sometimes. But yeah, so staying lean. One of the contentious decisions that I made along this line was not to have managers. Again, a lot of, how many managers here? As in managers who manage people. Okay, yeah, I decided not to have managers. Okay, at Flipkart, again, not just at Flipkart, I've had the opportunity to actually look into a lot of different companies, how they work, when they reach out for some help or something. And uniformly what I've found is middle management ends up making things slow, not because of any intent issue, but just because of the nature of human behavior. You have a person who's proxying for a group of people, that person will become the proxy. There's no way to avoid that. So essentially, all of communication now starts actually flowing through like this. Okay? Yes, it saves some people time, but these people start getting increasingly removed from the end problem, because it's the manager who's actually, guiding them. Because they lose visibility, their ability to make trade-offs actually goes down. So their dependence on the manager only goes up. They can't even have a debate. No, I disagree. What you're saying is wrong, because if we do this, then these other metrics actually get impacted. You cannot have that discussion because you don't have the full context. I'm talking about from the perspective of a typical engineer. Okay, so I decided not to have managers, which essentially meant that we will need self-managing people. Okay, so we put in a whole bunch of structures, which this time is too short for me to talk about, but we had to invest in structures that allows people to actually be self-managing. Okay. Um, yeah, the underlying belief here is that an individual's capacity to perform is a lot more than what they typically believing in themselves. Okay, and I saw this work at Udaan where, a few of the people on that side of the group are from Udaan. Some of those people graduated last year. And I can tell you that the context that they run with are actually more than what a 10-year experienced person would actually have about their organization. And the only reason is because of this environment of just exposing them to the problem statement directly and to rely on them completely instead of actually having managers in between. So around mid 2018, I came across an interesting problem. The problem was that of driving more wallet share. And the reason why I'm saying I came across this problem was because no matter which way I looked at it, I was not able to visualize putting an engineer on that problem. Why? Because driving a wallet share actually cut across just so many different problem statements that needed to come together in order to make this problem statement of wallet share succeed. Say, for example, you needed to work on credit product. You needed to work on the way we onboarded a new user. We needed to work on returns as a problem statement. So how to put an engineer on this? Because just the span seems so wide that the engineer would end up spending all of her time in researching the problem. Okay? That's when I realized that, you know what, maybe there is really a need for a product manager. So product managers in the room, I'm not against you. But what it did was it allowed us to have the product managers for precisely the right role. So mid 18 was our first product manager hire. Mid 19, we made 2 more offers, and some of those are sitting in this room as well. And the way we started structuring, the way I went about structuring this was, just like engineers, product managers own a problem. But what kind of problem? Where the time that is needed to research the problem continuously is just way more than the time needed to build something. Whereas places where there would be a reasonable mix of the two, we still have engineers actually owning the problem. And that continues to be the case for majority of the problems at Udaan. Okay, but for these kinds of problems where research was a continuous activity, we actually started having product managers. Interestingly, it allowed us to really distill out the expectations from a product manager to such a fine accuracy that we knew exactly what we want them to do. We don't want them to be postmen or postwomen of the organization. Iski baat utha karke wahan, the Narad Munis of the, not Narad Muni, you get what I'm trying to say, right? Just, being the communication conduit. That's a horrible way to exist as a product manager. I think the best product managers shine through when you actually give them a very meaty problem, when bulk of that meat of that problem actually involves that problem solving that is going on in their head. Digest data across very, very diverse domains. Come up with what actually makes sense. And majority of the time getting spent there, instead of majority of the time being spent in chasing engineers, ye kar do na please. Okay? So that's the difference that, it allowed us to do. So that is my note about, oh sorry, I should have come on to this, hiring PMs. That was my note about hiring PMs. Next one is solving for productivity. Okay? When we are running very, very lean, it becomes extremely critical for us to make sure that every person is empowered, not just empowered, but there are institutional mechanisms in place that allow them productivity. Some of the early choices that we made, one was related to simple tech choices, use Kotlin, which is a very productive language to have, use React on the front end, we embraced Azure as a cloud provider very, very deeply. We made a bunch of tech choices that allowed us to not focus on the every single thing breaking down, okay? We also made certain cultural choices. We said that Mondays would be dedicated meeting days. And all the days you are free. And guess what happened? Anybody? Every single day became a meeting day. Okay? Because no matter what you do, something that relies on individual discipline doesn't succeed in an organization. No matter what you do. You may have actually said that, shouted at the top of your voice about it, but it wouldn't work if you've not institutionalized it out. So that was a failure of a choice on my part, okay? Early 19, we saw that despite all of these decisions, one of the decisions was also that except for Monday, an engineer is allowed to work from home any other day. Work from home or work from warehouse or work from a shop, it's up to them. But despite all of these decisions, by early 19, some fatigue started coming in. And when we dug deeper, we realized that it is probably unfair on my part to ask the engineers to problem solve some of these things. Say, for example, there's a bunch of operational tasks that needed to be done because the product has not reached a level where you need to do something. Okay? So we allowed engineers the ability to set up their own ops team, which we refer to as a product ops. The advantage is that because the engineers are actually dictating what that ops should do, they make sure that this ops team is always serving that gap in the product instead of ultimately flipping around where they end up building a tool for an ops team which is solving the problem. Now, those of you who are not able to relate to this reference, I'll suggest that you just look at my earlier talk on this. I've gone into the details on this. But the point is that we created some of these institutional mechanisms that allowed engineers to rely on existing mechanisms in order to ease certain non-problem solving, non-building related things. Another such thing was user research, which our design team ended up doing a fantastic job of. They institutionalized the design research. So any engineer can put their hand up and say that, oh, this is a new product that I'm rolling out. I want to get a user design research on this. And they just ride on an existing mechanism. So these are some of the things that we did in order to ensure that we make people very, very productive. However, despite all of this, we realized that sometime around late 19, we realized that we were still not actually able to solve for this. What started happening was, you remember this piece about no code ownership, only problem statement ownership? Well, that bombed. Okay, and I know that a few of the engineers are thinking, "Ye to mujhe pata hi tha." Right? Well, because you're right. It bombed. Okay? Why? Because too many cooks were actually attacking the same thing. So despite having this, we still need some of those guardians who actually, in the open source world, what you refer to as the maintainer of piece of code, not just the maintainer, a person who cares about how the abstractions in this system are actually evolving, given a multitude of people actually contributing to the same repository. So we decided that we have a new role to come up with. We call them software engineers. Well, initially we called them remote engineers, and then we realized that a lot of people are getting confused about it. So we thought that, okay, we'll call it software engineer. Okay, but guess what? Because this is a pure systemic role, it allows us to keep this position completely remote. And from late 19 to now, we've actually been rolling out a few offers around this. So this is yet another role that we actually had to come up with. And it allowed us to take care of those gaps that come in because of that problem statement ownership model. In hindsight, I feel that I should have probably done that 6 months before I actually did. So yet another proof that no visionary